They tied a captive to a wooden board and let him drift with the sea. The two sons asked Ragnar in confusion about the purpose of doing this. Ragnar told them he was using a peculiar method to find the over 100 lost warships and over 3,000 warriors in the vast ocean. Just a few days ago, Ragnar had gathered over 100 warships, preparing to attack Paris, but the heavens are unpredictable. A storm completely disrupted their plans. The next day, when everyone woke up, they found only one ship floating alone on the sea. At this moment, Ragnar wanted to die. He stared blankly at the sunstone and sundial in his hand. Now, only the things in his hands could guide the direction to reach Paris. If the remaining ships couldn't find him, it meant those few thousand warriors might be lost in the vast ocean. After much thought, Ragnar decided to first sail into the Seine River and go ashore, then think of other methods. Fortunately, just as they were about to land, two more ships found Ragnar, and they also discovered a small group of Parisian sentries on the shore. A group quietly landed and easily took care of the Parisian sentries in the forest by the riverbank, establishing a camp there, but the Vikings didn't notice there was still one that slipped through the net. At the same time, to find the lost ships, Ragnar ordered a captive to be tied to a wooden board. The two sons asked him the purpose of doing this. Ragnar told them the Seine River was upstream of the ocean, so this captive would ultimately flow into the sea, and once the lost ships at sea discovered him, he would guide them to the direction of the Seine. Before long, they saw a beacon lit on the distant mountain. This meant the news of the Vikings' landing had already reached Paris. Ragnar knew the situation was dire. Now they only had a few hundred people. If the Parisians came to kill them, they would surely die. But at the moment, they had no way out. This completely angered the short-tempered Harold brothers. They grabbed the Parisian captives and directly tied them to the beacon and lit it. Floki also participated. At this time, Floki had already hit it off with the Harold brothers. After the water drop torture, Floki only had utter hatred for Ragnar, and the Harold brothers' devotion to the gods was very much to Floki's taste.
So now we've sent another signal to Paris! A signal from the gods! Do you think they can see it? Do you think they can understand it?
Inside the city of Paris, Charles, who knew the Vikings had come to attack again, was already scared out of his wits. He wept and begged Rollo, hoping he would help him fight the Vikings for the princess's sake. After all, only he was most familiar with the Vikings' tactics.
I will not betray you. I will not betray Paris, and I will not betray my wife.
Rollo's stance finally made Gisela have a good impression of this barbarian. Afterwards, Rollo found Odo and began to discuss countermeasures. Rollo suggested setting up fortress towers on both banks of the Seine River to prevent the Vikings from sailing directly to the city. Odo finally understood Rollo's meaning. This move of stringing iron chains across the river was indeed ingenious. At the same time, the drifting captive shouted himself hoarse in the ocean. The lost Viking ships finally found him. With this captive's guidance, more Viking warships entered the Seine River. After gathering these ships, the Vikings continued to advance towards Paris. On the way, Ragnar asked Edu for a mouthful of opium. Afterwards, Ragnar began to hallucinate. He seemed to see Lagertha, Gaida, and young Bjorn from a few years ago by the river. At that time, Ragnar was not an earl, not a king, he was just an ordinary farmer, but every one of their faces was filled with happy smiles. Although he had gained power now, he had forever lost that feeling from back then. Coming back to his senses, Ragnar saw a person he couldn't be more familiar with. Rollo. Rollo, now a duke, rode a tall horse, dressed in noble attire, with Parisian soldiers following behind him. Ragnar was furious. He kicked Bjorn, who had just been defending his uncle not long ago. Awake, Bjorn was unwilling to believe what was before his eyes, but whether he believed it or not, the current Rollo had already become the Vikings' enemy. Seeing the fortress towers established ahead, Ragnar ordered the entire army to set up camp on the riverbank. For this battle, Ragnar planned it like this: we'll send a squad to approach the fortress from the land. The death squad will attract the enemy's arrows and the rest of the ships will try to force their way through the fortress. This plan received unanimous approval from everyone. Lagertha also volunteered to lead the small land team to harass the fortress. Knowing Lagertha was already pregnant, Ragnar very much didn't want her to take the risk. After the meeting ended, Ragnar found Lagertha and told her not to take the risk, but Lagertha said, "What am I to you? If you have time, pay more attention to your current wife."
Father, can we fight with you tomorrow? Please.
You're not strong enough yet, boys. I want you to stay here. I want you to protect all the food and the supplies. Can you do that for me?
Yes, Father.
Yes?
Yes.
Okay.
Ragnar left the old, weak, sick, and disabled in the camp, then took the elite troops and officially set off towards the fortress. The Harald brothers were raring to go. They couldn't wait to slaughter the Christians. On the watchtower, Rollo was confident, quietly waiting for the warships to arrive. But he didn't notice that at this time, Lagertha's small team was quietly approaching the fortress. But as they walked, Lagertha discovered something was wrong. It turned out this was a swamp. Rollo had long anticipated Ragnar would attack from land, so he built the watchtower beside this swamp. The huge sound attracted Rollo's attention. When all the Vikings were stuck in the swamp, Rollo immediately ordered them to shoot arrows. Because they were deeply trapped, many Vikings were hit and fell before they could dodge. Ragnar ordered the warships to advance towards the fortress at full speed. The Parisian soldiers on the watchtower had to fight on two fronts. This brought Lagertha a brief respite. She led the remaining team members and struggled out of the swamp. But as Lagertha's team was advancing, a squad of Parisian soldiers wielding crossbows suddenly rushed out from the woods behind. Attacked from both sides, Lagertha had no choice but to lead the remnants of the troops to flee in panic. At the same time, over 100 warships had already sailed into the fortress. However, Rollo just lightly waved his hand, and a huge iron chain stretched across the middle of the Seine River, instantly overturning countless warships that were speeding over. Seeing a huge chain stretching across the middle of the Seine River, Ragnar immediately ordered the ships to turn around, but it was all too late. Because the speed of the ships was simply too fast, the iron chain directly overturned several warships. If it were just this, then you would be underestimating Rollo. He ordered the Parisian soldiers on the shore to bring out catapults, but strangely, what the catapults launched weren't stones, but bags of liquid.
Up until the overturned keel, clamber with a heart of steel. Cold is the ocean's spring, and your death is on its way.
An arrow was shot at the capsized ships. The fuel met fire and burned fiercely. In an instant, the entire sea was filled with the heart-wrenching wails of the Vikings. Faced with the burning warships, the Vikings desperately swam towards the ships behind that weren't on fire. Some were saved, but more people forever remained in the Seine River. In the chaos, Ragnar saw Floki struggling desperately. Ragnar was frozen in place. He didn't know whether to save a man who had betrayed him or not. Suddenly, a hand pulled Floki out. The one who saved him was none other than Ragnar, whom Floki deeply hated. Bjorn used a rope to pull them back onto the ship. Only at this moment did Floki understand who his true brother was in times of crisis. Seeing his men dead and wounded, Ragnar was overcome with grief and anger. He staggered to his feet and began to curse his traitorous brother Rollo.
This is how you repay my love! You had me with him. Go away! Come on!
Rollo had once said he had always lived in Ragnar's shadow. Outside, it was pitch black and he couldn't see any light at all. But now, Princess Gisla had become the light of his life. To gain power and glory, Rollo could betray everything, of course including his people and elder brother. After another defeat, Ragnar could only lead the remaining troops back to camp, but as soon as they landed, everyone was stunned by what they saw before them. It turned out that while they were fiercely fighting on the Seine River, their camp had also been attacked by Parisian soldiers. Not only did they kill all the elderly, weak, women and children left here, they also burned all the Vikings' grain and grass. It must be said, Rollo's scheme was indeed brilliant. Floki searched everywhere for his wife's figure. Not far away, he found Helga severely burned and on the verge of death. Fortunately, Ragnar's 2 children and Idu hid in the woods and escaped disaster. After cremating the warriors' corpses, Ragnar stared blankly at the camp that had been burned beyond recognition. Grief-stricken, Ragnar really couldn't bear the pressure. He found Idu and asked for more leaves. Not long after, Bjorn found Ragnar and asked him how they should fight next. The longer the time, the more prepared the Parisians would be. But Ragnar said,
Tell them tomorrow that we go back downriver.
Are you alright?
Just tell them tomorrow we retreat!
It is evident here that after eating this opium-like leaf, Ragnar became cowardly. He had developed a fear of war. The next day, the Vikings began the return journey. The troops were all very dissatisfied with Ragnar's weakness. The Vikings could be defeated in battle, but they couldn't accept returning empty-handed. The Harald brothers felt Ragnar was merely a paper tiger. Could such a cowardly person still be a legendary figure of the Vikings? Faced with everyone's doubts, Ragnar remained silent until they passed a cliff. A nearly crazy plan to defeat the enemy suddenly flashed through Ragnar's mind.
Bien.
What? Tell everyone. We're going to make camp here.
Ragnar suddenly told Bjorn to stop the ship and announced they would set up camp on top of the cliff. Harald was very puzzled. There were many places to camp, so why choose a place like a cliff? Ragnar explained to everyone. On the way back, I carefully observed that the Seine River is a river that flows around mountains. We can let the warships climb the cliff and then cross the mountains to go upstream of the fortress. The Parisians absolutely won't imagine such an ingenious method, and they won't have time to build a new fortress now. Then we can directly attack the city of Paris and catch them off guard. Everyone thought Ragnar's head must have gone bad. This idea sounded not bad, but each ship weighed over a dozen tons, so how could hundreds of warships fly up the cliff, cross the forest, and fall into the river upstream? Ragnar looked at Floki with full confidence. He believed this genius Floki would definitely be able to do it.
No? I can do it, Ragnar. I can do it for you.
Being used by Ragnar again, Floki was overjoyed. So next was how to accomplish Ragnar's great vision. The first step was to empty the equipment on the ships, which would make them easier to hoist. Then, it was to use the latest device developed by Floki to pull the warships up bit by bit. I wonder if everyone noticed that this wooden thing looked exactly like a crane of today, and there were even 2 iron pulleys at the top of the fulcrum. It must be said, Floki's inventive ability was indeed at its peak. Seeing the warships being hoisted up the cliff one by one, Harald was full of admiration for Ragnar. Only then did he realize why Ragnar was called the Legend of the Vikings. But obviously, Ragnar had no mind to listen to and flatter him here. At this moment, his drug addiction was acting up again. Ragnar hurriedly found Idu, wanting more leaves, but Idu said she had none left.
You're lying again. The only reason I wanted you to come was because of the medicine.
This made Idu heartbroken. She treated Ragnar with all her heart, but in the end, she wasn't even as important as a small leaf. Idu leaves in anger and threatens to make public the secret of the massacre of the Viking settlement in England. You should know, the last person who knew this secret had already been smothered by Ragnar. How could he let Idu off? Ragnar suddenly turned around and pressed Idu dead in the water. Finally, Edu stopped breathing. Ragnar took out the last bit of opium from her pocket, but when he turned around, he found his two sons staring at him trembling. Ragnar went up and told them not to tell anyone. Then he made an excuse to send the sons away and finally returned to the water to push Edu's corpse into the corner. At the same time, most of the ships had been hoisted ashore. Floki was still laying logs on the ground to serve as a road base. To make towing easier, Floki even specially arranged for people to apply grease on the logs to reduce friction. But while the Vikings were trekking through the mountains, a pair of Frankish farmers discovered them. But they didn't realize the seriousness of the problem and chose to ignore it. They just silently prayed these Vikings wouldn't discover their farm. Speak of the devil, in the blink of an eye, the Harald brothers brought their men to their farm. They went in and looted valuables everywhere. A bouquet of flowers on the table caught Harald's attention.
There are women here.
Soon, they found the villagers hiding in the hayloft of the cowshed, of course including the farmer's two daughters. After a bout of humiliation, they ransacked the small farm, leaving only a house of corpses and walls of blood. Although they left one alive, the person's eyes were cruelly gouged out. After several days of effort, the Vikings trekked dozens of miles through the mountains and finally arrived upstream of the fortress. Across the river, everyone could clearly see the city of Paris within reach. Just as everyone was cheering, Ragnar couldn't be happy at all, because there was only one leaf left in his pocket. Ragnar decided to save it for the great battle, because only then could he muster the energy to fight. Ragnar found Floki and told him to build an unprecedented aeroship according to his vision. During the preparations, due to the lack of leaves, Ragnar's mental state became worse and worse, and all of this was seen by his son Bjorn.
It's what Yedu gave you, isn't it?
She told me it was medicine, but now I feel poisoned without it.
Then take some more.
I only have a little bit left. I have to save it to fight Rollo.
A few days later, all the ships had completely fallen into the river. It turned out that what Ragnar had Floki build was this platform that looked like an aircraft carrier. This way, it would be more convenient for them to fight at sea. With preparations complete, the crowd grandly advanced towards Paris. At this time, Rollo wasn't idle either. After learning from the villager whose eyes were gouged out that the Vikings had crossed the mountains, Rollo ordered people to build warships day and night. He decided to have a decisive battle with Ragnar on the river.